tea gets sold as one of the cleanest things in the grocery store. A plain box, a calm ritual, a steaming cup that feels older than the marketing wrapped around it. And that is exactly why this aisle gets away with so much. Because most people do not walk into the tea section looking for deception. They walk in looking for comfort, for a familiar logo, for a flavor they already know, for something that looks gentle, simple, maybe even healthier than the rest of the cart. But tea is one of those categories where the front of the box can make you feel informed long before you actually are. Heritage branding can hide commodity tea. Peaceful packaging can hide vague flavor systems. Wellness language can do a lot of emotional work before the ingredients say anything useful at all. And once you start noticing how often tea is sold on mood, ritual, and borrowed trust instead of real clarity, the aisle starts looking very different. So this is not about saying every bag from these brands is poison, or pretending every box is part of some giant scandal. It is simpler than that, and honestly more useful. This is about the tea brands I would stop buying first if you care about what is actually in the cup, how much the box is doing with branding instead of transparency, and whether you are paying for tea, or just paying for the feeling of having bought tea. Number 7 is Tetley. Tetley is the kind of brand that wins by being familiar enough to feel invisible. It has that old-school supermarket gravity. It looks established. It looks dependable. It looks like the kind of tea your family may have bought for years without ever needing to explain why. And that is the problem. Tetley often gets treated as a default purchase, not an evaluated one. The box says tea, the price feels reasonable, the brand has history, and the decision is over before the shopper has asked a single real question. What tea leaves are actually in here? From where? What are the standards behind the blend? How much of the experience is tea quality? And how much is flavoring, familiarity, and shelf dominance? In some of its fruit and herbal products, the brand openly refers to natural flavorings alongside fruits, herbs, and flowers. That does not automatically make it a bad product. But it does mean the product is not as straightforward as the soft, simple image suggests. And in a category where buyers assume that tea equals minimal processing and plain ingredients, that assumption matters. Tetley is not the worst offender in the aisle. It is worse in a different way. It trains people to stop looking. It turns tea into an automatic purchase, and the moment a brand becomes your autopilot buy, it no longer has to earn your trust box by box. Verdict: if you are buying Tetley because it feels safely generic, that is the exact reason to pause. Number 6 is Tazo. Tazo sells drama beautifully, rich colors, moody flavor names, that almost cafe-adjacent energy, where the box makes the tea feel more curated than it may actually be. It is not selling leaves first, it is selling an experience, and for a lot of shoppers, that works. The brand feels more elevated than the bargain box tea sitting next to it. It sounds more adventurous, it feels like the choice of someone with taste. But once you move past the front panel, the real value often starts to blur. Many Tazo blends are heavily built around flavor architecture. Botanicals, acids, spices, fruit notes, natural flavors, layered sensory cues designed to create a memorable profile whether or not the tea itself is doing most of the work. Again, that is not automatically dishonest, but it is a very different thing from the clean, leaf-forward simplicity many tea buyers think they are purchasing. What Tazo is especially good at is making flavor complexity feel like ingredient integrity. Those are not the same thing. A loud aromatic cup can impress you immediately and still tell you very little about sourcing clarity, bag material, or how much of the profile depends on flavor inputs rather than tea quality. You see this all the time with passion fruit, dessert, citrus, and spice-heavy blends across the grocery aisle. The tea becomes a stage, the flavor system becomes the performer. And because the cup tastes vivid, people assume the product must be premium. But strong taste is not proof of strong transparency. That is one of the oldest tricks in packaged food. Verdict: if you are buying Tazo because it feels more sophisticated than standard tea, make sure you are not just paying for atmosphere in a box. Number 5 is Bigelow. Bigelow is one of the most trusted names in the category because it feels domestic, familiar, and stable. The brand identity says reliability, family business, classic tea, something that has stayed grounded while the rest of the aisle went trend-heavy. And that image gives it enormous room to coast. Because when a brand feels wholesome, most shoppers stop auditing it with the same skepticism they would use on a flashy newcomer. But Bigelow is a perfect example of why trust signals and transparency are not interchangeable. The company talks about natural flavors being derived from real fruits, spices, flowers, herbs, and botanicals. That sounds reassuring. But it still leaves the average buyer in the same place a lot of natural flavor language leaves them. Trusting a category word instead of understanding what actually shaped the cup. Bigelow also spans everything from straightforward black and green teas to more flavored, more functional, more mood-based products. And the wider a brand's portfolio gets, the more careful you have to be about assuming the whole line deserves the same level of confidence. The nice thing about grocery tea is that the calmest box often gets the least scrutiny. The downside is that shoppers start treating the entire brand as one simple product when it is really a whole shelf of very different formulations and very different reasons to buy. If you want a plain tea, fine. But if you are reaching for Bigelow, because the brand itself makes you feel like you have already done your homework, that feeling may be doing too much of the decision-making. Verdict: a trusted family name is not the same thing as a fully transparent cup. Before we get into the upper half of this list, notice the pattern starting to form. None of these brands have to deceive in some dramatic movie villain way to become weak buys. They just have to let the packaging do more clarity work than the label actually does. They just have to be familiar enough, elegant enough, or wholesome enough that you stop asking ordinary shopper questions. What exactly am I drinking? What is flavoring this cup? What part of this premium image is tea, and what part is theater? And when you zoom out, that is when the category gets interesting, because tea is sold as one of the least suspicious foods in the store, while relying on some of the same trust shortcuts as every other packaged aisle. Number 4 is Celestial Seasonings. Celestial Seasonings has one of the softest brand identities in the tea section. Peaceful illustrations, sleepy names, wellness-adjacent calm without looking aggressive about it. It feels almost impossible to be mad at. That is part of its power. The brand projects innocence. It is tea as comfort object, tea as bedtime ritual, tea as a small good decision at the end of a long day. But if you are buying for ingredient literacy, and not just emotional familiarity, this is where the distance between packaging and product starts to matter more. A lot of Celestial Seasonings blends, especially in the herbal and dessert style lanes, lean on a mixture of herbs, spices, botanicals, and natural flavors to create the identity of the cup. That matters because the front of the box often sells a vivid expectation long before the consumer reaches the ingredient panel. Berry, vanilla, citrus, cake-like sweetness, cozy spice. These aren't just tea choices, they are mood promises. And the more a product depends on that promise, the more important it becomes to ask whether you are buying whole ingredient clarity or just a cleverly staged impression of it. This is where many people start realizing that the tea aisle is full of products that feel more natural than they actually explain themselves to be. Celestial Seasonings is not alone in that, but it may be one of the clearest examples of how a gentle brand aesthetic can lower a shopper's guard. If something looks peaceful enough, people assume it must also be straightforward. Those are separate questions. A calming box is not a transparent box. A comforting flavor name is not a sourcing story, and a bedtime ritual can still be built on vague inputs the average buyer never meant to sign up for. Verdict: if the brand's softness makes you trust it automatically, that softness may be the very thing preventing a closer read. Number 3 is Yogi. Yogi is where tea stops being just tea and starts borrowing authority from the language around well-being. The boxes do not just suggest flavor, they suggest function. Stress relief, bedtime support, immune support, digestive calm, balance, restore, breathe. That is extremely powerful marketing because it moves the shopper out of the simple beverage mindset and into the self-care mindset. And once that happens, the purchase feels smarter than it may actually be. You are no longer just buying a drink. You are buying a direction, a little ritual of control, a small act of being responsible. That is a very easy emotional sell in a tired, anxious, health-conscious culture. Now, Yogi does provide information about ingredients and says its organic flavors come from natural sources such as spices, fruits, herbs, and roots. Fine, but that still does not change the larger issue. which is that the brand often sells functional confidence first and ingredient scrutiny second. A lot of people reach for Yogi because the box seems to understand their problem before they do. And that is exactly when labels deserve more attention, not less. If the product is tea, let it be tea. If it is an herbal blend, let it be an herbal blend. But when packaging starts feeling like a soft substitute for real guidance, shoppers can project far more certainty onto the product than the cup actually warrants. The tea aisle is not a clinic. A branded blend is not personal advice. And while that may sound obvious when said out loud, the entire success of this category depends on shoppers forgetting that for a moment. Yogi is not high on this list because every product is terrible. It is high because the brand is especially good at making ordinary packaged tea feel like a wise decision in a box. That emotional premium is powerful, and if you never slow down and separate ritual language from real label clarity, you can spend years buying the feeling of support instead of simply evaluating the product in your hand. Verdict: if a tea sounds like it already has answers for your life, that is when you need to read it like a skeptic. Now pause on one detail that matters far beyond any single brand. Tea bags themselves are not always as simple as people think. A lot of shoppers picture paper, leaf, hot water, end of story. But research around tea bags has raised much bigger questions than that. Some tea bags have used plastic materials such as polypropylene or nylon, and some paper bags may include plastic sealants. One heavily discussed study found that a plastic tea bag steeped at brewing temperature could release billions of micro and nanoparticles into the water. That does not mean every tea bag on this shelf is doing the same thing. It does mean the category has trained consumers to assume simplicity where verification is often missing. And once you realize that, the question is no longer just what is in the tea. It is also what the tea is sitting in, what the box tells you about that, and how many brands are still relying on the shopper not asking. Number 2 is Twinings. Twinings may be the most convincing premium illusion in the mainstream tea aisle because it does not need to look flashy to feel upscale. The heritage does the work. The crest, the typography, the old-world polish, the sense that this brand has already survived generations and therefore must deserve its reputation. Twinings understands how to turn history into shorthand. When people buy it, they often feel like they are upgrading from mass-market tea into something more refined, without having to move into specialty pricing. But legacy branding can cover a lot of modern compromises. Across flavored lines, Twinings uses flavor systems that sit comfortably inside the polite language of the tea world. Natural strawberry flavor, orange flavor, chai flavor with other natural flavors. It all sounds civilized. It all sounds intentional, and because the brand has such a polished identity, those phrases land very differently than they would on a louder, less elegant box. On Twinings, vagueness gets mistaken for sophistication. That is the real trick. Heritage makes ambiguity feel premium. The average buyer sees the box and assumes care, craftsmanship, and tradition. But the actual buying question is more practical than that. Are you paying for leaf quality and genuine clarity, or are you paying for a reputation that smooths over the same vague ingredient habits found throughout the aisle? Twinings is not a brand people usually suspect, because it looks too respectable to interrogate. That is exactly why it deserves to be interrogated. The more polished the trust signal, the less likely people are to challenge it. And in tea, that can keep consumers overpaying for a premium feeling, without getting premium transparency in return. Verdict: when elegance replaces explanation, the brand is asking your imagination to do some of the work. Number 1 is Lipton. And this one matters most, because it is not just a tea brand. It is one of the biggest trust shortcuts in the entire category. Lipton is everywhere. Offices, hotels, diners, family kitchens, grocery stores where the box barely needs an introduction because it already feels like part of the background of daily life. That level of familiarity changes consumer behavior more than people realize. Nobody thinks they need to investigate Lipton. It is the tea equivalent of a brand people inherit before they choose. And because it is so normalized, the brand gets to represent tea itself for millions of shoppers. That is exactly why it is the first autopilot buy I would break. Here is the real issue with Lipton. Even when a product looks straightforward, like a classic black tea blend, the brand still benefits from the biggest illusion in the aisle, the idea that ubiquity equals trustworthiness. But scale is not transparency. Legacy is not detail. Consistency is not the same thing as quality you can actually see and verify. In flavored products, the brand openly uses natural flavor blends. In FAQs and brand language, it frames some herbal teas around blends of grains, fruit flavors, sweet spices, leaves, flowers, and roots. Again, none of that automatically makes the product unacceptable. The problem is that Lipton is so dominant that shoppers often give it credit for simplicity, without actually checking whether that simplicity exists in the way they imagine. The bright yellow box has become a substitute for scrutiny, and Lipton matters for another reason. It represents the lowest friction version of tea buying: cheap enough, familiar enough, available enough, pleasant enough. No research required, no thought required, just tea. But the moment a category becomes that frictionless, consumers stop asking the questions that separate an okay buy from a genuinely smart one. Where are the leaves from? What kind of tea quality am I getting? What is the bag made of? If there is flavoring, how much of the experience depends on that, instead of the underlying tea? Is this brand winning because it is transparent, or because it has been in my field of vision for so long that I confuse recognition with merit? That is why Lipton lands at number 1. Not because it is the most theatrical brand, not because it makes the wildest promises, but because it trains the largest number of people to stop looking. It turns the tea aisle into muscle memory, and in consumer categories, muscle memory is where weak value hides best. Verdict: if you want to get smarter about tea, the first thing to stop buying is the brand you never felt the need to question. And once you break that reflex, the whole aisle changes. Because now the goal is not to find a perfect brand with a halo over it. The goal is to move toward brands that give you more to work with. More packaging clarity, more sourcing signals, more obvious respect for what tea buyers are actually trying to avoid. Less mood fog, less trust by default, less just take our word for it energy. The first switch I would make is Republic of Tea. What makes Republic of Tea interesting is not that it is magically above criticism, it is that it gives shoppers some concrete details that actually matter. The company says its signature round tea bags are made from unbleached tea paper, free of excess wrapping, strings, tags, and staples. It also says no chlorine-containing compounds are used in the paper. That is useful information. Not branding poetry, not emotional theater. Real packaging details a shopper can understand and evaluate. And in a category where tea bag material can become a blind spot fast, that kind of clarity immediately sets a better tone. The brand also tends to present itself more like a tea merchant than a wellness oracle. That helps. You are encouraged to think in terms of tea, ingredients, and sensory experience, not vague life solutions. Is every blend equally minimalist? No, you still need to read the box. But the difference is that Republic of Tea gives a more visible packaging story, and that alone makes it a far stronger place to start than brands that rely mostly on familiarity or emotional positioning. It feels less like you are buying a borrowed reputation, and more like you are buying a product that expects to be examined. The second switch is Numi. Numi stands out because it addresses two of the biggest concerns in modern grocery tea at the same time: sourcing and bag material. The company talks openly about organic and fair trade sourcing, and it says its tea bags are made from biodegradable, unbleached manila hemp fiber, rather than plastic. It also says the bags are oxygen whitened instead of bleached. Again, whether any individual shopper chooses this brand is up to them. But those are exactly the kinds of details a tea buyer should want to hear more often. Not just crafted with care, not just inspired by tradition. Specifics. What is the bag made of? What is the sourcing standard? What is the brand doing to distinguish itself from the vague, mood-based trust signals dominating the aisle? Numi feels more aligned with the actual questions modern consumers are starting to ask. And that matters because tea has spent years being underestimated as a category. People audit protein bars harder than they audit tea. They interrogate breakfast cereal more than they interrogate what sits in boiling water for 5 minutes and gets pitched as one of the cleanest habits in the kitchen. Numi is not appealing because it sounds moral. It is appealing because it makes more of the right information visible. Now, if you take nothing else from this list, take this buying rule with you. Stop choosing tea by brand familiarity alone. That is the whole game. The tea aisle wants you calm, nostalgic, a little aspirational, and done thinking by the time your hand reaches the box. Break that. Read the ingredient panel, especially on flavored and herbal products. Pay attention to how often natural flavor is carrying the identity of the cup. Look for brands that tell you something useful about bag material, not just what the tea tastes like. Separate tea from wellness theater. Separate premium aesthetics from actual clarity. And remember that the problem is often not what the box says outright. The problem is what the box never has to say, because the branding already made you feel safe. That is the deeper truth behind this whole category. Tea sells trust in one of the quietest ways in the store. No screaming claims, no neon powders, no aggressive performance language in most cases. Just calm colors, old names, soft promises, and a cup people assume must be simple, because it feels traditional. But tradition can be a costume too. Heritage can be packaging, familiarity can be a smokescreen, and a tea ritual can still be built on vague ingredients, weak packaging clarity, and a lot of borrowed confidence. So if you have one of these brands in your kitchen right now, this is not about panic. It is about pattern recognition. It is about noticing where you may have been buying the image of a smarter choice instead of the substance of one. That gap matters. Because the shopper who thinks they are being careful is often the exact shopper most likely to trust the wrong signals. If you disagree with this list, I want to hear which brand you would move up or down and why. If there is a tea you swear by, especially one that is unusually transparent about sourcing or bag materials, drop it in the comments. And if there is another grocery category where the front of the package tells a very different story than the label, that should probably be the next one we open up.